Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back for another video. Now, if you happen to be new to the channel, then let me fill you in a little on what I've been up to lately. So I've been making a TV stand recently, and in my last video, I showed you guys how I made the TV stand base. If you haven't seen that video already, I'll leave it linked below so you can go and check that out. That means that this week I'm going to be making the top for the TV stand, and that meant pouring an epoxy river table for the very first time. Let me show you guys how it went. To create this river table, I started with a slab of walnut that I had picked up well over a year ago with the intention of making a river table one day. The size of this slab seemed to work nicely for what I had in mind for this build. Now, what I'm not going to show you in this video is footage of me removing all of the dead bark from the edges of this slab. Like I said before, I've had this slab for over a year now, and I removed all of that bark when I first got it, and that was pre-YouTube channel days, so you're just going to have to imagine me doing that. Now, in order to have that river table effect, I was going to have to cut this slab down the middle and then basically invert my two halves. So that meant my first step was to get this thing cut in half. Well, how do you cut something in half that's not even on both sides? That's a good question. I'm glad you asked. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you because honestly, I had no clue myself. But I can tell you what I did. I don't know if it's right, but it seemed to work out okay for me. In order to figure out where I wanted to cut the slab down the middle, I found the center point on each of my sides. I then lined up a chalk line on both of those marks that I made and made a chalk line based off of those center points just to give me a visual representation of where I wanted to cut my slab in half. So next step is to try to get this thing cut in half. Basically, all I did was try to find the center point on each side. Obviously, this side is a lot wider than that side. So basically, I just took the center point of each of those sides and made a mark. And then I tried to connect those marks and used a chalk line to kind of lay it out. And then I set up this straight edge guide that I can run my circular saw against to help me get a straight line. Now, I don't know if this is the right way to do this, but this is how I've decided to do it. And hopefully, fingers crossed, this is gonna work out and I'll be able to basically slice this slab in half. Let's see. So I'm not sure why I thought my little battery powered circular saw might cut through this, but I definitely am gonna have to bring out the powered circular saw, and then hopefully that'll be able to cut through this pretty thick slab. Now, with that, it means I've got to reset up all of my edge guides, so let's do that. Now, I love my little Ryobi battery powered circular saw. It's able to handle about 90% of everything I need to cut with it, but for cutting this thicker slab, having a powered circular saw was definitely much preferred. It made much quicker work of cutting through this thing. I just took my time with it, making sure to follow along my edge guide, and I had this thing cut in half in no time. With my slab cut in half, I flipped each piece over and I was starting to visualize how this river table was going to look. However, the pieces were still a little bit too big for what I was going to be needing for this TV stand, so my next step was to trim them to size. Now, I left the pieces a little bit bigger than I need, and I will cut everything to its final size once the epoxy has cured and the river table is one unit. All right, so now it's time for me to figure out exactly how much epoxy I'm gonna need for this river table. So to get started, the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna figure out what is this width here where the epoxy is gonna be. Now, I'm not gonna just take one measurement, obviously, because it changes a lot in dimension. So what I did is I made marks every 2 inches all the way down each board. And then what I'm gonna do is use my tape measure and then take that measurement on those 2-inch marks, and then I'll take the average of all of those measurements, and that'll roughly give me the average width of this opening here. All right, so on this first one, I've got about 4 3/4. Okay, so maybe you don't need to go every 2 inches. You could probably space these out a little bit more, but I wanted to just try to be a little bit more accurate, so I did every 2 inches. Now I'm gonna take all of these measurements and I'm gonna add them up on a calculator because I'm not doing all this math in my head, and then I'm gonna find the average of this width. Okay, so I've averaged all of the widths that I calculated, and it gives me an average width of about 6 inches between these two pieces here. So next thing I need to figure out is I need to factor in the height of these pieces, and if I take a measurement here, they're about 1.5 inches on each side. I will, you know, once I finish this, I will be taking some of that dimension off, but for the purposes of figuring out the epoxy, we're going to plug in 1.5 inches for our height. And then the final dimension that we needed to know is how long these pieces are here. And they're each about 68 inches long. So with those measurements that I took, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to head to calculator.net, and I'm going to go to the rectangular tank volume calculator, and I'm going to plug in each of those dimensions. So for my length, I'm going to do 68 inches. Okay, it'll auto-populate to feet. Make sure you change it to inches. For my width, I put 6 inches because that's what I averaged, and then for my height, I put 1.5. And then that's going to give me how many cubic inches I have. So that tells me that the volume of those measurements that I just inputted is 612 cubic inches. So that doesn't really help me out that much. The next step is to take that number, and type in Google cubic inches to liters conversion. And when I do that, now I can type in that 612 cubic inch, and that gives me 10.0289 liters. Now you want to be able to add about 10% onto that. You're going to need about 10% extra just to make sure you have enough. And if you don't want it in liters, you can change it from liters to gallons. And that tells me that I need about 2.64935 gallons. I'm going to add about 10% to that. So we're looking somewhere in the 2.5 to 3 gallon range for this particular pour, I think. So I'm going to start researching some epoxies and figure out which one I want to go with, and then I'll go ahead and get that epoxy ordered in the amount that I need. Now I'm going to be needing the actually the epoxy resin and the hardener. There's probably a lot of kits out there, so I'm going to do some research and see what I can find. And next step was getting the mold made for this thing so that when the epoxy arrives, we're ready to pour. So let me show you what I'm going to be using to make the mold for this. Alright guys, so this is what I'm going to be using to make the mold for the epoxy river table. And I'm sure most of you guys have seen this stuff before. It's basically just a sheet of melamine board that I picked up from Lowe's, and it's basically just a bunch of composite material with a sheet of laminate on both sides. Now I chose to use this material because, you know, it was relatively cheap given current lumber prices. I think I picked this up for about 43 bucks. And given that price point, this thing is pretty flat, which is gonna be a really big advantage when it comes to making this mold. Also, I didn't just get into this river table without doing any research or watching any fellow YouTubers videos that have done this before. And basically what I found is that a lot of people do use this melamine board for their molds. And so, you know, I just wanna be like everyone else. So I did decide to go ahead and use the melamine. You could also use something like MDF or something that's really sturdy and flat. Now, even though this has a very slick coating on it, I'm not going to rely on that slick coating to keep the epoxy from sticking. Again, from watching fellow YouTubers, I've learned that basically you want to make sure to wrap all of this in some Tyvek tape, so I will be doing that as well. So my next step is I need to go ahead and get those pieces cut to size that I need to make the mold, and then once I have them cut, I can work on getting everything joined together and getting it taped up, and we'll be getting pretty close to time to pour epoxy. So let's get going. Now I wanted my mold to be a pretty snug fit, so I took some measurements with my boards mocked up so that I could get everything cut to the correct size. The first piece I cut out was the bottom panel, and I oversized it a bit so I would have plenty of room to attach the other pieces to it. For the side and end pieces, I cut some 3-inch wide strips out of my remaining melamine board. Then I took my pieces over to the miter saw and I cut them to the exact dimensions that I needed for my mold. Next up was wrapping all of the pieces for my mold in some Tyvek tape. This little tip is something that I picked up from doing my research for this epoxy pour. Now, this tape really does work at keeping epoxy from sticking to your mold. It's basically tape that contractors use for wrapping houses during construction, so it's super resistant to moisture. And even though it's not cheap, coming in at around $15 a roll, I don't know, that just feels like a lot for tape. But I can say that this stuff is definitely worth applying when it comes to making a mold for an epoxy pour. All right, I've got all of the pieces for my mold here now, and I kind of feel like this is kind of like a big paint project that I'm working on. I mean, most of the work is in the prep work. I'll probably only spend a couple minutes actually pouring the epoxy, but I've spent quite a bit longer making sure that this mold is gonna work and gonna be hopefully leak proof. You know, I think it's important to spend the extra time when it comes to the mold. That way I can keep all of the epoxy inside this river table. I mean, epoxy's not cheap, and I'm not trying to have it run all over my shop, make a big mess, and lose a bunch of money in epoxy. So I took the time to make sure everything was taped up well. I have a few extra steps that I'll take once this thing's together, but my next step is to go ahead and start getting the mold box formed. And basically what I chose to do is I drilled some pocket holes. Actually, I drilled an insane amount of pocket holes. I want to make sure that I can seal this thing up as good as I can. So I've got pocket holes in a lot of these pieces, and now what I'm going to do is just form out my box, use those screws to tie everything together. So now let's just work on getting this thing together. Alright guys, I decided that before I finish putting together this mold here, I want to go ahead and try to flatten these pieces, because take a look at this. As you can see, this is what some would call a potato chip. Super uneven, and I think because these pieces are small enough, fortunately, that I can run through my planer, I'm gonna go ahead and put these on a planer sled, run them through, try to get them a little bit flatter. That way, when I go to pour the epoxy, I have a little bit more flat pieces that I'm working with, and I don't have to deal with some of this wobble here. So next step is let me go ahead, get these things run through my planer, and then we'll finish putting together the mold. To flatten these boards, I used some leftover melamine board that I cut just wide enough to run through my planer. Then I attached the boards to the melamine board by flipping it over and countersinking some screws through the bottom. Then with it flipped back over, I placed some shims in all of the areas that had a big gap between the walnut board and the melamine board. I used a hot glue gun to put some glue on the shims so that they would hold in place. The shims will keep the planer blades from pushing your board down and keep it from getting flat. Once the hot glue had dried, I came in with a flush cut saw and trimmed the excess shims off. Then it was time to get this thing run through the planer. Now, my husband happened to be home and offered to help me run these boards through, which was very generous because these long pieces can be a pain to run through by yourself. Once we had one side run through several times, I flipped the board over and removed the screws and shims. Then we ran the opposite side through the planer again until we had the thickness we were after. Using this technique should help get a lot of that wobble out of your boards. Okay, so now that these pieces are mostly flat, as you can see, most of that heavy wobble is gone. I'll be honest with you, there's still a tiny bit of wobble. I didn't want to take off too much right now, but luckily I should be able to just clamp this down and that will really help with that. So now that these are flat, the next step is I just need to continue putting together the rest of my mold. Once my mold's together, then I'll work on taking the steps to make sure it's sealed up good, adding some silicone and stuff like that. And then there's a few extra steps that I'll do before it comes time to pouring the epoxy. Remember what I said before, most of the work with stuff like this is in the prep work. So I want to make sure that I have everything done before it comes time to actually pouring that epoxy. So next step is I'm going to go ahead and finish putting this mold together and work on sealing it all up. So now it's time to seal up this mold. Basically, I want to seal up all of these seams here where my mold pieces come together. And to seal up those joints, I'm going to be using some silicone caulking. A little tip that I learned from John Malecki's videos, which by the way, since I'm doing this for the first time, he has a ton of great videos out for like first time epoxy pouring, river tables, stuff like that. I would highly recommend if you're doing this for the first time like me, head over to his channel, check out some of his videos. I'll leave his channel linked in the description box below so you can check some of those out. But one of the tips I learned from him is using some black caulking when it comes to filling up all of these seams and basically sealing everything off. The black caulking will just basically be able to help me see everywhere that I have caulking. That's one thing you don't want to miss. You want to make sure that you have everything sealed up as good as possible so that I don't have any epoxy leaking out. And since this mold is heavily white, the contrast between the black should help me be able to see exactly where I have caulking and if I've missed anywhere. So the other thing I sort of did was I traced out exactly where the pieces are going to sit in here, and then when it comes time to actually putting the pieces back, I plan on putting a little thin layer of some silicone caulking here that I can press my pieces down onto. My hope is that will help kind of seal off some of the epoxy from floating underneath the wooden pieces. So let me go ahead and get started on caulking up all these seams. One important factor to note when sealing up your mold is to give the silicone time to fully dry. I made sure that I allowed ample amount of time for the stuff to dry before I poured any epoxy. I know waiting is sometimes tough when you're in project mode, but this isn't something you want to rush. And now it's finally time for the thing I've been saying it's almost time for pretty much the whole video. It's time to pour some epoxy. Now, I wasn't quite done with my prep work yet though. Before I could pour, we decided to lay down some plastic sheeting in case this little experiment was a total failure and I ended up leaking epoxy everywhere. I also spent some time cleaning up the shop and cleaning up any visible dust anywhere, which, to be honest, needed to be done anyways. I figured the cleaner the environment for this pour, the less chances of something getting in the epoxy. I set my mold up on my work surface on some scrap boards to give myself room to add clamps, and then I moved on to probably one of the most important parts of my prep, and that was getting my mold completely level. I spent a lot of time checking for level, then double checking, then triple checking. You get the idea. The deep pour epoxy I'm going to be using is like water pretty much. So if my mold wasn't completely level, then my epoxy would flow unevenly to one area. So I made absolute certain it was level beforehand. To get it level, I simply placed some shims under my mold in any areas that needed them. Referencing that outline that I had traced before, I applied some more of that silicone caulking to my mold. I then placed my walnut boards back into my mold and worked on getting them clamped down. I didn't want the epoxy to cause my boards to float up during the pour, so to clamp them down, I just used some scrap blocks that I wrapped in more of that magical Tyvek tape, and then I just used a couple of clamps to hold them down. Since I'm doing this for the first time, you knew I was going to make a couple rookie mistakes. One of those mishaps was forgetting to spray the mold release into the mold before I put my boards in, which I just feel like would have been easier and more effective. But since I forgot, I just sprayed a little of this stuff in my mold where the epoxy would go, and then I just used a brush to spread it. Now, I'm not going to be too hard on myself though, because this mold release stuff is probably just optional anyways. And hey, there was a lot of stuff to remember when it came to this epoxy pour, and I feel like I did alright. Alright guys, it's time to finally pour the epoxy, and I gotta admit, I'm pretty freaking nervous about this. I mean, most things that I build when it comes to woodworking, if I screw something up, I typically can find a way to fix it. Working with epoxy, you don't really get that luxury. Unfortunately, if things don't go right, I might just be out of all the money that I spent on this epoxy. But we're gonna cross our fingers and hope that everything's gonna go smoothly. I think I've done all the prep work that I need to do to make this river pour successful. So as far as the epoxy that I'm gonna be using, I'm gonna be using some of this liquid glass 2 to 4 inch thick pour epoxy. And that's nice because it's gonna allow me to basically be able to pour this river table all at once. Now I'm dealing with about 1 inch of depth as far as the actual epoxy pour that I'm going for. So luckily by using this type of epoxy, I can go ahead and pour that all at once, and I don't have to pour a layer, let it cure, pour another layer. So this is gonna hopefully speed up that process. Now this particular epoxy calls for a 2 to 1 ratio of the resin to hardener. So I've basically done some math and figured out exactly what particular ratio that I need to mix my epoxy together. So my next step is I just need to go ahead and use those calculations to figure out. I'm going for about 2 gallons worth of epoxy and hardener. So I'm just basically gonna mix the two together, and then I've got my drill here with this drill attachment that I'll use to sort of mix everything together really well, and then it'll be time to add the color and get ready to pour that epoxy. All right, let's get going. Also worth mentioning when it comes to working with epoxy, I definitely recommend wearing some gloves. Obviously you don't want to get this stuff on your hands, it'll be super hard to get off. I like to also wear safety glasses and a respirator because I'm super sensitive to VOCs and stuff like that. So I'll also be wearing some of that PPE. All right, let's go ahead and get this mixed up. First of all, let me clean out this bucket here. This bucket is a little bit dirty. I'm gonna be using colored epoxy, so it doesn't have to be 100% perfect, but you want to try to get your bucket as clean as possible, so that way you don't have any of that debris in there. All right, so that looks pretty good. All right. Also, I'm going to be having my husband help me with the next few steps because having a buddy to help with some of these, with this type of thing is just really beneficial because, there's a lot of steps, there's a lot of stuff that you want to kind of help control, and so he's going to step in and help me with some of the next few steps. Once I had the right amount of resin and hardener in my bucket, it was time to get it mixed together well. To do that, I used that mixer attachment on my drill, and I mixed the two together for about 8 minutes total. It's really tempting to not mix for the entire time because, well, this is extremely boring. But it is important to mix it properly for the full amount of time while trying to limit the amount of air bubbles you mix into the epoxy. After about 6 minutes of mixing, I added some black mica powder from Black Diamond Pigments and spent a couple more minutes getting that mixed in well. We had a bit of an issue with the resin sticking to the sides of the bucket, so we teamed up to mix it together. having one person scrape the sides of the bucket as the other one mixed with the drill. All right, so I got it all mixed up. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna transfer some into this smaller bucket here. When it comes to the actual pouring it in, I think having a smaller bucket will just give me a little bit more control, and I'm not trying to just handle that 5-gallon bucket. So next step is get some epoxy poured in here, and then I'm just gonna try to slowly pour it into this river table until I get it to the depth that I want. Who's nervous? Ugh, I'm nervous.
You got it.
Are you nervous? No.
Just money.
It's just money. I decided to try and pop as many air bubbles as I could between each layer of epoxy that I poured. To pop those bubbles, I just used a propane torch and tried not to get the flame too close to the epoxy. From there, I just kept pouring layers of epoxy until I had it filled completely. I would pour a layer of epoxy and then Phil would come behind me and pop any air bubbles. And while I thought I had mixed up enough epoxy with my first batch, it turns out that I needed just a tiny bit more, so we had to mix up just a bit more to get this thing completely filled. Which meant I was stuck with another 8 minutes of painstakingly boring mixing, this time by hand, unfortunately. But at least this time I had some comic relief in the form of listening to Phil struggle with Alexa. Sometimes she really rubs him the wrong way.
Alexa, set a timer for 2 minutes and 15 seconds.
Second timer, 2 minutes and 15 seconds, starting now. Do you want to name this timer?
Name it, Alexa is stupid. Good. Shut her up.
After the second batch of epoxy was fully mixed together, I made my final few pours into my river table, and then it was time to just sit back, not relax, and pray this thing didn't leak out everywhere. After my initial pour, I let the epoxy do its thing, and I would come back and check on it about every hour for the first 8 hours, just to see if there were any air bubbles that needed to be popped. Other than that, all I could do now was just wait for it to cure, which took all in all about 72 hours. Alright guys, so I've been letting this thing sit for a couple of days now, and now I am going to let it cure for a little bit longer before I get to my next step of flattening it, but I definitely think it's hard enough now where I can move on to trying to get it out of this mold. So let me see if I can get this thing out of here, hopefully relatively easy. This epoxy really doesn't stick to this Tyvek tape, which is pretty cool. So easy. That wasn't bad. Next step is I gotta take out all of these pocket hole screws that I put in here, and there were quite a few. Alright, now I'm going to take a little knife and try to run it along this outside joint where I caulked around, and hopefully I can break that up a little bit to make it a little bit easier to get this thing apart. Perfect! Alright, let's keep getting this thing apart. Now the real test is to see how hard it's going to be to get off of this bottom piece. We'll see. Okay, here's what I discovered. This is feeling really nice and hard, but when I started to pick this up from the bottom, it's still a little bit gummy. So I think I need to let this cure for a few days extra, or at least another day or two. I don't want to mess with it trying to pull it off here until this thing is good and solid. So back to the waiting game. I'm just gonna let this sit for a little while longer, and then I'll come back to it in a couple days and see if it's hard enough for me to remove from this base. All right, let's try this again. All right, final pull. He's a beaut, Clark. We have liftoff. Would you guys just look at this thing?
Oh, would you look at that?
I'll put that
Just
on.
look at that.
I can't pull it out either. I'd have to drill it.
Would you just look at it?
Yeah.
I mean, come on. It's pretty cool, right? Or at least it will be when I'm done with it. As you can see, I got a little bit crazy with my last few epoxy pours, and that's why I have all of this excess epoxy here on the wooden pieces. And that's just something that I'm gonna have to take care of in my next step when it comes to getting this thing flattened and cleaned up. But man, this thing actually turned out all right. I gotta say, I'm not that disappointed in myself. Let's talk about some of the major wins. The first one being that this mold did not leak epoxy at all. I mean, that was one of the things that I was most nervous about. I did not want to leak epoxy out of this mold, and I'm super happy that this thing held all the epoxy in place, so that's a major win. The second thing is this was not that hard to get out of the mold. I thought that I might really have to struggle to get this thing out of the mold, but this thing actually popped out so easy. I was quite surprised by that. So I don't know if I just made sure I put enough tape on there, or maybe the mold release really did help with that. And then let's talk about another win. I figured out the correct amount of epoxy for this pour. I made sure that I had enough epoxy with all my calculations. I got the right type of epoxy, and it actually cured correctly. So those are all things that in the back of my mind I was a little bit nervous about, that I might screw something up when it came to any of those things. But that's just an example of why you should not let the fear of failure stop you from trying something. I was afraid that some of those things could go wrong, yet I still was willing to try, and look, it turned out great. Are there a few lessons that I could take into my next epoxy pour? Of course there are, but all in all, for my first time pouring epoxy, I'm pretty happy with this. We're gonna call it a win, guys. Well, I did it, guys. I poured an epoxy river tabletop for the first time, and you know what? This thing looks all right. I'm actually kind of proud of it. As you can see though, I'm nowhere near done with this thing. I still have a lot of work ahead of me. I've got to get this thing cleaned up, get all this excess epoxy off, get it flat, get it finished, and all that's going to take place in my next video. Now, if you've watched any of my videos on my channel before, then you know that I don't have any sort of commercial grade tools. I don't have a planer that I could just send this thing through. So I'm going to have to find another way that I can get this thing cleaned up and flat. And basically I'll just be making a flattening jig and using my router, and like I said, that'll take place in my next video. So if you're not already subscribed, consider getting subscribed, hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on my next video. But with that said, this video is a wrap. I've got a big mess to clean up, so I'll be seeing you guys later. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.